It's Game Boy World, and this is Nemesis. We've seen, even within the admittedly short span of Game Boy World to date, how you go about making a bad Game Boy game. You can be cheap or apathetic and shovel out something in a hurry, sure, but even if you care, you can still bungle the job, especially if you're trying to convert a console game experience into the portable format. The Game Boy might have been the little cousin to the NES, but it was still a very different system with wildly separate capabilities. Wildly more limited capabilities, that is. And no approach to designing Game Boy conversions offered a faster road to abject failure than trying to make an NES game work within the boundaries of the Game Boy without accepting the fact that you have to make some compromises to pull it off. The best games we've seen so far in Game Boy World have usually been NES down conversions whose designers recognized the inherent limitations within the platform and adjusted accordingly, as with Super Mario Land. Even Castlevania succeeded in that respect, although it admittedly dropped the ball in others. But Nemesis might just offer the smartest and most effective means of making a great and appealing Game Boy experience we've seen so far. As its cover art and logo clearly demonstrate, Nemesis amounts to a portable sequel to Gradius. I do somewhat question Konami's approach to branding here. Nemesis was the third game in the Gradius family to make its way to the US, but none of them shared a name in common despite their closely related mechanics. Gradius had been Konami's entree into the American console market back in 1986, of course, and they followed it up with 1988's Life Force, a reworking of the Gradius-like arcade shooter Salamander. Now, here in 1990, we have Nemesis, which takes its name from a pair of Gradius spin-offs that only saw the light of day on MSX, and only in Japan. Nevertheless, this game is absolutely a part of the Gradius line, even more so than Life Force had been. So, 8-bit Konami, good at making games, not so good at branding. I'd suggest the title's abandonment of the Gradius trademark came from the fact that Konami published this under the Ultra Games label in the US and had to use a different brand for legal reasons, but it was called Nemesis in Japan too, so who the heck even knows? Still, the logo treatment and the obvious emphasis on a tiny starfighter should make it clear that this was a close relation to that classic NES shooter. The relationship remains clear and obvious throughout. Nemesis sees players shooting their way through 6 stages of familiar sights like Moai heads and biotechnological fortresses, and of course, Nemesis carries with it the classic Gradius power-up schematic. Certain enemies drop capsules, which you can gather to trade in for ship upgrades. With each capsule, the power-up indicator advances 1 step, meaning each upgrade comes with its own specific cost. 1 capsule for speed, 4 for lasers, 6 for shields, etc. This represents Gradius's and Nemesis's fundamental strategic underpinning. Beyond simply being able to shoot bad guys and avoid bullets, you also need to calculate which power-ups will be most useful in a given situation, and how best to ration your perks when you know you have a limited number of capsules available in the immediate future. Nemesis resultantly suffers from the classic Gradius unbalancing problem, of course. The Vic Viper, or in this case the Proteus 911, is essentially indestructible when you're fully powered up. But if you do blow it and let the bad guys take you out, it can be agonizingly difficult to get back up to speed. You lose all your powers and all your reserve capsules upon death. This makes for a long and difficult battle back to the boss. If you die midway through the stage, you probably won't be able to restore your full power before the boss fight. Bosses can be cake for a fully empowered Rattler, but they're kind of hellish otherwise. This Gradius conundrum can be frustrating under the best of circumstances, but on Game Boy, where the sluggish screen refresh and limited resolution make for a cramped combat situation where enemy projectiles are painfully difficult to keep track of, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. How could the ups and downs of the Gradius experience possibly be entertaining in such a context? Well, impossible as it may sound, Konami pulled it off. Compared to the Game Boy's sole previous shoot-'em-up, Solar Striker, Nemesis both looks better and plays better. The graphics are every bit as rich as you'd expect from Konami. They're monochromatic, sure, and the scrolling's a little choppy. But it's detailed, with a smaller than usual ship skating through comfortably proportioned environments, packed with nicely drawn scenery. The difference between this and Solar Striker is like the difference between the original Gradius for NES and early Famicom shooters like Formation Z. It's just a better game all around. Better looking, deeper, more complex. But it's also a game affected by the Game Boy's limitations. The genius of Nemesis is that its creators, specifically producer-designer Naoki Matsui, recognized the inevitable challenges inherent in Game Boy software and accounted for them. Matsui didn't water down the shooting elements of Nemesis, slow the action, or reduce the number of deadly hazards flying around. Instead, he allowed players to determine just how difficult the game would be for them. Nemesis offers an unprecedented level of player control over how hard the game is. Multiple difficulty levels, a full stage select, auto-fire, and the ability to grant yourself up to 99 lives. All of this is available by default right up front with no cheat codes. But it does have cheat codes aplenty, including the Konami code, which fully powers up the Proteus. It also has a screen-clearing destruction code and even codes to make the game more difficult by clearing away power-ups and capsules. The idea here is to make Nemesis totally approachable for any and everyone, casual or young or inexperienced players, but at the same time it can present a traditionally difficult Gradius experience, or even harder as you desire. More than that, it allows players to account for the complications and compromises resulting from the Game Boy's limits, and it makes Nemesis unusually scalable to better technology. Whereas Solar Striker's simplicity made it manageable on the original Game Boy hardware and incredibly boring on platforms with better screen tech, Nemesis's fluid difficulty options make it playable and fun no matter which Game Boy incarnation you're playing on. You can take the content tourist approach and just cruise through the game on easy difficulty with maxed out lives and auto-fire and cheat codes, or you can take the ultra-hardcore route, improve your skills with all kinds of handicaps. This sort of as-you-will freedom flew in the face of late 80s and early 90s game design, which still operated on a love for arcade hero machismo, especially with shooters. But Matsui and his small team were willing to buck conventional wisdom and make a fundamental change that greatly improved the end-user experience. The result is one of the strongest early Game Boy releases of any genre, both then and now. Matsui, incidentally, had previously worked on a handful of games at Konami, including the second MSX Nemesis, which probably does account for this release's title, despite the lack of a narrative link to the other Nemesis. And Konami would eventually get its Gradius branding together. Nemesis 2 for Game Boy was retitled Gradius The Interstellar Assault in the US, and probably sold a lot better as a result. But as this game proves, a name is just a name. The original Nemesis offered a high-quality Gradius experience, regardless of the trademark on the box. And even if you switch the options totally in your favor, it's still a pretty tough game. For more games that defy the odds, keep reading GameBoyWorld.com. Please consider supporting this project through Patreon, or buy the book.